Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this evening for Dr. Best. My name is Jessica Halsey with the Addiction Policy Forum, and we're a part of JCOIN, the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network. JCOIN is a groundbreaking initiative designed to advance scientific knowledge on effective policies, practices, and interventions, and to expand their use in daily practice within health and justice settings. I'm really excited you could join us today for our webinar on measuring and operationalizing recovery capital. We have really excited to have our guest speaker today, but first I wanted to hand this over to Julia Zur, who's part of our JCOIN team at NIDA. So Julia is a program officer at the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the Services Research Branch, which supports the National Program for Health Services Research to improve the quality of the drug abuse treatment system. And I'm also really excited that Dr. David Best can join us today. He's a professor at Leeds Trinity University and the director of the Center for Addiction Recovery Research there. So thank you both for joining us today. We're really excited. We're going to leave a little bit of room at the end of the webinar for some Q&A. But first, I'm going to turn this over to Julia, Dr. Zur.
Thank you, Jess, for that introduction. So like Jess said, I am a program officer at NIDA, and I'm working on the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network. For those unfamiliar with JCOIN, I know Jess gave a little bit of background, but to just let you know a little bit more, this was an initiative created and is led by Dr. Tisha Wiley, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. It is supported by the HEAL initiative, which stands for Helping to End Addiction Long Term. And HEAL is an NIH-wide initiative that was developed in response to the opioid crisis. And JCOIN is the only HEAL-funded program that specifically focuses on justice-involved individuals with substance use disorders. So our vision with JCOIN is that every individual involved in the justice system with a substance use disorder should have access to effective services, whether they're detained or while they're in the community. And so after or during involvement with the criminal legal system, it can be really challenging to create a fulfilling life. And, you know, as I'm sure many of you know, people with substance use disorders often experience a lot of stigma. And this is even more profound among people with criminal legal involvement. So it's a very vulnerable population in need of a great amount of support to really achieve and sustain recovery. So a lot of the research funded through JCOIN involves linking people to appropriate services following incarceration or other involvement with the criminal legal system. And when we think about what these services look like, we really need to be mindful of recovery support beyond just getting people on medication for opioid use disorder, decreasing substance use. We really want to be thinking broadly about recovery and helping people lead more fulfilling lives. So this webinar focused on recovery, and recovery capital is part of a number of webinars and other types of educational content about topics related to the work we do with JCOIN. And it's particularly exciting to be having this webinar during Recovery Month, and we're thrilled to have Dr. David Best participate. We actually had the pleasure of having him speak at one of our JCOIN steering committee meetings, which generated a lot of great discussion about how we can think about recovery capital in the context of achieving our vision with JCOIN, and really reinforced that service provision doesn't stop as soon as people are connected to treatment and are able to decrease substance use. We really need to support them in the long term. So we're really excited to have Dr. Best speak to you all. And of course, wanted to thank Jess and the rest of the APF team for putting these great webinars together. I encourage you to check on many of the other wonderful webinars and courses and resources that are available thanks to our coordination center. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Best. And again, just wanted to thank you all for being here.
Many thanks, Julia, and thank you for the introduction. And I would also like to thank both Jess and Haley for all the support, and hopefully my slides will appear shortly on the screen. But while we're transitioning over to that, I will just say a little bit of introduction about myself. So, perfect, thank you very much. So, my name is David Best. I'm mainly based in the UK at Leeds Trinity University, but I also hold an honorary professorship at Australian National University and an honorary associate professorship at Monash University in Melbourne in the Eastern Health Clinical School. And I'm president of the Recovery Outcomes Institute. And I will talk quite a bit about the Recovery Outcomes Institute work as I move forward. But really, by way of introduction, I wanted to start by saying a little bit about my own background, my own journey. And I will be focusing primarily on recovery capital, and I'll do that for a reason that I hope will become apparent as I move forward. So I guess I started, and I've worked in the addictions field for around 30 years now. And I started working as a clinical researcher, a psychologist and a clinical researcher in a massive teaching hospital in South London called the Maudsley Hospital. And there I was involved in a range of clinical processes, and I was always slightly dissatisfied with the lack of follow through, that we knew relatively little about what happened to people after they left our specialist services. And far too many of them came back, and sadly, several of them never came back for reasons that were nothing to do with recovery. And it was a big shock to me when I was, I guess, probably about 15 years ago now, I was invited to preside a 12-step graduation ceremony in a prison in the northwest of England called Lancaster Castle. And I was so struck by the sense of collective efficacy, pride. Parents and partners of the graduates had been invited into prison for the graduation ceremony, and it was an incredibly touching, moving thing, and really inspired me, I guess, with the idea that I should focus and switch my research from primarily focusing on treatment and treatment effectiveness to looking much more at those bigger, more complex and slightly messier questions about recovery. And some of this work was originally stymied and certainly was heavily criticized back in the early to mid 2000s by the suggestion that, well, recovery is an interesting thing, but it's an incredibly complicated thing for a science or a research point of view, because as we know, no two people's recovery journeys are the same. And it shifts and moves, and it's very subjective and internal and personalized, and it's a complicated process. And if you look at most of the definitions of recovery, they describe it as a journey rather than a state. And so it brought a certain level of contempt or sneering from various parts of the addiction science community about what was this thing we were talking about, and would it ever be possible to characterize or measure it? And really, for me, the big thing that changed that was the introduction of the concept recovery capital. And recovery capital effectively does two things as far as I can see. One, it provides a metric. It offers a way, however imperfect to date, of allowing us to start to count things. And because it allows us to count things, it then allows us to start developing, testing, and testing hypothesis to allow the principle of falsifiability, Popper's principle of falsifiability, to be tested. In other words, instead of us talking about wishful thinking and processes of change, now we can start to say, okay, this is something we can genuinely count. We can quantify where people are in this journey, and we can start to look at how we would intervene to improve that journey and that process. So if I can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to start with some very early, so there's three broad sections that I will talk about. So in this first section, I'll say a little bit about theory and the development of theory. The next section, I'll focus on data and research. And in the final section, I'll switch the focus onto where we're going now and what future developments are likely to be. So if you can just move on again, Haley, that would be helpful. Perfect. So we basically have some data, and what I've attempted to do here is put down two models of a number, but the left-hand side of the slide is really about the epidemiology of recovery. The right-hand side is about what we can do to support and help the process. So on the left-hand side, we know that from work that's been carried out over a number of years and a huge number of studies, and there are review articles by Sheedy and Whitter for SAMHSA, and also by one of the key figures he'll talk about more shortly in the recovery movement called William White. that suggests somewhere between 50 and 58% of people who have a lifetime substance use disorder will eventually achieve stable recovery. And what do we mean by stable recovery? Well, what we mean is, and the operationalized version of this, as cited in the Betty Ford consensus document, is that in the first year after people detoxify or stop using, the likelihood of relapse is between 50 and 70%. 5 years later, this drops to around 14% and really doesn't drop any lower beyond that point. What we can say about that is that recovery is a process over time, and then by the end of that 5 years, which obviously is an average, that people have self-sustaining recovery, to use a phrase from Michael Dennis, who is also quoted here. In other words, and I'll come back to this because we have some data that suggests that, at least in Europe, there might be some slightly different ways of looking at that question. And again, using work from Chestnut Health and Michael Dennis, he argued that the typical addiction career lasts for around 28 years, with around 4 to 5 episodes of treatment constituting about 8 years of that process. Now, in my own work, we started, one of my first studies, in fact, into recovery. We looked at around 110, 120 people, and we started reviewing their recovery careers. And one of the things we found was that why people stop and why people manage to sustain their recovery are not the same thing. So typically people would stop because of an event that compounded chronic dissatisfaction with lifestyle. So in other words, people would be unhappy with how their life was going, unhappy with their using patterns, and then something would happen, arrest, a health crisis, or whatever it was, that would finally allow them to make a sustainable change. However, what kept people stopped, what sustained their recovery, was other people. And this started what I refer to, and a number of other people refer to, as the social model of recovery. And I will argue that recovery is a fundamentally and intrinsically social process. So to switch to the right-hand side of the slide, Mary Leamy and colleagues published a review article in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2011, where they summarized the evidence for what works supporting mental health recovery. And this is really important because left-hand side, epidemiology and patterns of recovery, right-hand side, what can we do about it? And that the right-hand side of the slide is characterized by this idea that there are 5 core characteristics of supporting recovery, and that recovery has a kind of process. And the idea here is that positive social connections generates a sense of hope that allows people to engage in meaningful activities that in turn empowers them and creates a positive sense of identity. And you will notice that sadly, it's not quite in the right order. And obviously it's dynamic and complex and interrelated, but fundamentally it starts with social process, that positive social connection is the starting point for this change journey. Next slide, please, Haley. And I guess one of the things that I feel obliged to do when I do these presentations is to acknowledge and credit the work of 2 men, only one of whom is shown in the photo here, who is William White. And if any of you are interested in looking at the history of recovery and a huge wealth of research, discussion, concept, then I strongly recommend reviewing williamwhitepapers.com, which is an astonishing treasure trove of information. And likewise is the work led by Professor John Kelly of Harvard Medical School in the form of the Recovery Research Institute, which provides a huge amount of online research and data about recovery and recovery processes. So I would strongly recommend you go to both of these things, and I particularly owe a debt of gratitude to William White for his incredible support of my work and my career over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, where he has provided both inspiration and guidance in equal measure. So moving along, next slide, please. I'm going to talk about 2 papers that I've been involved in the last a year or 18 months or so. One of which we started to do a review of the science of recovery capital. And in both cases, I'm incredibly grateful to my co-authors, Dr. Emily Hennessy, who's also from the Recovery Research Institute, where we started looking at the science of recovery capital. Where do we go from here? And I guess the core point I really want to make about that is that recovery capital is beginning to emerge as a credible, viable science. We have some things that we start to be able to know, some things that we start to be able to count, but we have a long, long way to go. We're in a very early stage of operationalizing and measuring recovery capital. So that really is a kind of state of the nation type paper. And the other paper, which was published in Addiction Research and Theory, is a much, much more conceptual framing of this issue, which is called Ink Spots and Ice Cream Cones. And I will come back to that shortly. But the idea here is how two core concepts of recovery, contagion and cascade, go together and meet to produce what I would regard as the core concepts of recovery change. Next slide, please, Haley. Perfect. So how does this work in practice? I'm going to come back to the notion of CHIME. And for me, there is the process of both measurement and accounting on the left-hand side vertically, and the engine of CHIME. So just to repeat how I think this works, that positive social connections are the catalyst, the spark, if you like. And hope is the fuel in the engine. And between those two things, they generate the capacity and willingness to do stuff. And it has struck me in much of my work that the two primary pillars of recovery are positive social connections, in other words, not social isolation and not social networks that are embedded in using or offending networks, but networks that are consistent with the recovery journey, and the sense of meaningful activities. And meaningful activities are fundamental and crucial to this process because effectively the relationship between connection and access to social supports and resources and meaningful activities generates and drives that movement for change, generates and drives the car for that 5-year process. And in essence, what we do from a recovery capital science perspective is to attempt to monitor and measure that process, to create plans around how that should happen, and then to follow an active social engagement process with positive resources to allow that process to happen. And in essence, and I was involved in a paper in 2016 called the Social Identity Model of Recovery, that much of what the meaningful activities produces in the way of the square at the front of the car is this sense where engagement in meaningful activities helps people to have a sense of empowerment, both as self-esteem and as self-efficacy, and that informs a positive sense of identity, both personal identity and group identity, that enables and empowers that change process. And so for my work, the two kind of conceptual frames, if you like, are the idea of CHIME and the idea of recovery capital, and they are intrinsically linked, both as mechanisms for counting, but also what you're attempting to do. And I would have to say, you know, I have moved a long, long way from the early days of my career where I was involved in running randomized controlled trials and randomized clinical trials to a point where I would now regard myself as very much a research activist. I don't regard myself as impartial or neutral or detached from this process. I see my job in large part as finding ways to evidence the process of recovery, not to challenge whether it exists or whether it's a good thing, but to attempt to come up with different mechanisms and methods for mapping and measuring recovery, and recovery capital has become the metric for that. Next slide, please. Perfect. Now, part of that work has involved me in around 2 years ago. I became a founding member of something called the College for Lived Experience Recovery Organisations in the UK. And the College for Lived Experience Recovery Organisations came about really at the start of COVID, when there was an opportunity for a group of us to get together online once a week. Most of the people in the group run their own LEROs, which I guess in American language would either be recovery community organizations or recovery community centres. And what we wanted to do was to try and do three things. We wanted to start trying to create a British evidence base for lived experience recovery organisations. We wanted to chart and map out innovation. And the UK, as in America, one of the huge challenges is the phenomenal wealth of innovative practice that goes on in the recovery world that's very poorly documented, far less scientifically evaluated. And then thirdly, to create a set of quality standards around the development of core basic principles and values for lived experience recovery organisations. And as we stand now, two and a half years later in 2022, the underlying principle and mechanism for those quality standards is CHIME: connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. That provides the framework for quality standards for recovery organisations in the UK. And ultimately, the test of how they are growing and evolving and developing is fundamentally around that question of saying, how can we create a model and a mechanism that allows CHIME to be operationalised consistently and effectively as part of a recovery growth process. So really, for me, part of the conceptual model is about saying, how do we translate these principles into things that can be used and utilised on a day-to-day basis? Next slide, please. And that brings me to the notion of ice cream cones and ink spots. So I said right at the start, I think one of the challenges for recovery and recovery research, and I hope that some of the researchers on the call will respond to this, is very similar to challenges that faced restorative justice. And I read a wonderful article by Jennifer Llewellyn from Dalhousie University about restorative justice, where she kind of argued that when restorative justice is put up against other justice initiatives and activities in trials, it does just about as well as the supposed gold standard evidence. But what the other initiatives fail to do that restorative justice does, and I would argue that recovery initiatives does, is that the beneficiary is not just the little individual who, in my ice cream cone, is sat at the very bottom. And ultimately, our aim is to try and say, how can we support and enable that individual to grow sufficient recovery capital to support and sustain their recovery journey? And in my world, that's done both by individual level recovery capital building, social recovery capital building, and community recovery capital building. But part of the reason why this is an intrinsically social model is the ice cream both flows up and down the way. That the community assets represented by ABCD, asset-based community development, that are measured through social identity mapping, help to allow us to support the growth of personal capital through the utilization of both social and community capital. But there is another crucial point that I will come back to, is that as the process of individual recovery well-being grows, it has a residual benefit. And the delightfully drawn sprinkles on both the left and right-hand side diagrams are the residual gain for the community. That, as I'll come to with crime, every successful recovery journey doesn't just adhere to the individual in exactly the same way that restorative justice doesn't adhere to the individual. It has a positive ripple and echo effect to the group and to the community. Next slide, please. And fundamentally, this links to a very similar notion in criminology. And I'll talk shortly about a second core academic called John Braithwaite. But his idea is for restorative justice and for social capital interventions, we can't think about simply identifying through trial research what works and replicating it, because it has to be more locally context bound and more socially contagious. And so the spread of innovation takes the form of cascades, which he referred to as ink spots. And that allows the dissemination and diffusion and spread of successful recovery. So the terribly drawn diagram here combines both cascades effects in the form of ink spots, and the growth of individual and group capital in the form of ice cream cones. Please bear with me on this. Next slide, please. Here he is, Professor John Braithwaite, who I'm delighted to call a colleague and a friend, who is the former director of the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University in Canberra. Next slide, please. And I want to draw on a quote from his most recent book, which is called Macro Criminology and Freedom. And this is fundamental for me for the notion of capital and recovery capital in particular. So he argues social capital, human capital, recovery capital, and restorative capital, what he's terming the collective name for restorative justice, are unlike financial capital in that they are not depleted through use. When you spend your money from the bank, you deplete your capital. When you trust somebody, in other words, it's a fundamentally relational process, you do not deplete trust. Trust tends to be reciprocated, and this engenders virtuous circles of trust building. A politics of hope is likewise redemptive as we face adversity. It is infectious. And this for me is fundamental, that as the individual grows, and I will argue that recovery capital comes from social connection and access to community resources, and through the overcoming of both self-stigmatization and community stigmatization, that the same process applies. That what is happening here is that recovery is fundamentally about both the individual growing within the group, but the group growing as a consequence, and the benefits leaking into the community or the society where that occurs. Next slide, please. Perfect. So now I'm coming to some definitional issues. What is recovery capital? Well, the definition that was used by Cloud and Granfield in 2008 was the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and drug problems. And one of those authors, William White, combined with a person I mentioned earlier, William Cloud and William White, to argue somewhat boldly, I think, that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets and not on the basis of recovery pathologies. So here are some of the challenges for both a science of recovery and for a measurement and metric system. The way that recovery science will differ fundamentally from traditional addiction or treatment science is we don't start from the assumption that the aim is to reduce a series of deficits. We start from the assumption that the aim is to build strengths and build strengths over time. So when we talk about a model of recovery or a paradigm of recovery, to use another somewhat ambitious term, what we're really saying is there are things that are fundamentally different about what recovery looks like to what treatment looks like. And I'm drawn back to my early days at the Maudsley, where I used to run a brief assessment clinic for opiate addicts. And basically I would have to do 6 interviews in 3 hours with people who were trying to access medication-assisted treatment. And basically over the course of half an hour, I'd sit with a big long questionnaire and I'd ask people about their physical health problems, their mental health problems, their bloodborne viruses, their involvement in crime, their housing problems, their relationship problems, their sexual health problems, their employment problems, their family problems and family histories. It was a pathology-focused approach, predicated in the assumption of aiming for some kind of 0 point. In other words, what is the point of treatment? The point of treatment is the removal of pathology and returning people to a neutral or normal state. That is not the model of recovery. That is not how recovery works. So what are some of the fundamental differences? The premises are recovery is community focused, not clinic focused. Socially based and socially predicated, not based on the notion of resolving or curing a pathologized individual. That it is future focused, and that it is strengths based. Those fundamental principles underlie the notion of what a recovery model is. And that's why assets rather than pathologies is fundamental to this approach. And when we want to count it, we don't discount the idea of pathology, but we have to focus on doing something different. And incidentally, it offers some kind of explanation for why the traditional measures like the Addiction Severity Index may not be optimal for measuring the effectiveness of things like recovery community organizations, therapeutic communities, recovery housing, because they are effectively about measuring the impact of acute clinical intervention, how interventions reduce bad things that happen in people's lives, not about growing those sustainable building blocks for the long-term change and long-term recovery. So there is something very important about saying a recovery model is fundamentally a strengths-based model. Okay, next slide, please. I'm probably going too slowly, so I'm going to start trying to speed up a little bit. So having come across those definitions, I did some research, which I'll talk about in a little while, and I combined the results with a researcher from New York called Alexandra Lodi, who'd done a long-term recovery study there. And we decided that we were going to try and characterize what were the common characteristics of recovery capital. And we came up with the idea that it was like a pie with 3 slices to it. That if we wanted to understand what recovery capital meant, there were 3 bits. Personal recovery capital, which included and appeared to be dominated by self-esteem, self-efficacy, communications skills, resilience, and coping skills. And to some extent, that is the building those things, those self-sustaining recovery is the long-term ultimate goal. But to do so, 2 other slices of the pie are needed. The first is social support, and Longabaugh in 2010 argued that one of the biggest predictors of successful recovery was transitioning from a social network supportive of drinking to a social network supportive of recovery. The other part that we felt was crucial, and in this paper, which was a position paper written for the Royal Society for the Arts in the UK, was that we called it collective capital, although I now call it community capital. And the aim there was to say, what are those things that have to be available, not in the immediate social network, but the broader context that support and allow that change process? And those things included things like access to houses, access to jobs, access to effective alcohol and drug treatment, but also access to visible recovery champions and communities. Okay, next slide, please. And just to give you an idea of how this might work, it then allows you to start thinking about creating a kind of taxonomy with those 3 dimensions, personal, social, and community across the columns. And you could argue positive and negative, and then some things negatively specific to stigma, just as an example, across the bottom. And now we're starting to work towards that model where we start to be able to count these things. We start to be able to identify and quantify some of those processes. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to move on to a bit of research and a bit of data. And I make only some apologies, really, I suppose, for primarily using my own data for doing this. So much of this, and I claim no privileged position, but I'm going to talk mainly about the work I've done in contributing to this discussion and this debate, particularly about recovery capital. Okay, next slide, please. So this may seem like a slightly surprising image to see in the middle of a slide on recovery. It doesn't look very recovery focused, but this is indeed a picture of Saturn devouring his son, painted by the Spanish painter Francisco Goya. And I will explain why this is in here very shortly. Next slide, please. Okay, so we conducted a large study of recovery well-being in people in Birmingham, and then a slightly larger study in Glasgow, my home city, which is for people who don't know, Glasgow is in the west of Scotland and is very much a kind of post-industrial city, which now has quite significant drug and alcohol problems. Anyway, at this time, when we collected the data, maybe 12, 13 years ago, we wanted to try and assess for people who self-identified as being in recovery, what seemed to be the predictors of higher levels of well-being and quality of life among this population? And we found there were two broad pillars. The first was the more time people spent with other people in recovery, the better their well-being and quality of life. And the second thing, which I guess surprised us, was we did a basic kind of inventory of what activities people had engaged in the previous week. And we found that the more time people spent in a range of basic activities, childcare, community group involvement, volunteering, education and training, and employment, the better their well-being. So to go back to Goya, why Goya? Well, Goya is an incredibly sophisticated scientific term we came up with that stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And apologies to anyone American who objects to the word arse, but I am sticking to that because where I was brought up, an ass is a kind of horse, so arse is definitely a bit more descriptive as well. Anyway, forget the linguistics, on to the next slide. And we were kind of criticized for this. And so we did a follow-up study where we looked at meaningful activities in 3 English drug action team areas over the course of a year using routine data from something called the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System. And basically what we did was we tried to look at the extent to which people were involved in at least some kind of meaningful activity, whether that was employment or education or volunteering. And the reason we did this was the challenge had been clear. People criticized the previous paper, the Goya paper, on the grounds of saying, well, are you sure it's not people who've already got higher well-being or quality of life who then do more? So basically what we looked at was change in those measures. We looked at changes in meaningful activities, and we looked at changes in 3 markers of well-being: physical quality of life, psychological quality of life, and overall quality of life. And the effects were very, very stark. Where people stopped meaningful activities over the course of a year, all 3 of those well-being quality of life markers went down. When they started meaningful activities, they went up. If they did them continuously through the year, they were significantly higher than the population who didn't do them at any point during the year. Now, as researchers and scientists, most of you are aware of the fact that we can't claim this as a causal effect. But what we can say with some confidence is that there is a clear association and relationship between the initiation of meaningful activities and significant bump up in your well-being, and not the other way around. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I apologize that this looks like one of those slides that researchers use to show off how clever they are, which I'd love to be able to do, but I'm not actually clever enough, A, to either have come up with this slide, or B, to really explain it very well myself. So I will do what I can. So we found those effects about meaningful activities in Glasgow and Birmingham, and then followed them up in the 3 drug action team areas. And we followed this up with a study of recovery residences in Florida. And this is written up in a paper by Ivan Cano, myself and other colleagues in 2017 in drug and alcohol dependence, I think. Where what we showed basically was the standard treatment effect. If you read from the bottom left across the slide, the longer people stay in a recovery residence, the less barriers they have to the recovery, the fewer unmet needs they have, and the greater their overall well-being. However, if they use that time in recovery residence to engage in meaningful activities, there is also a bump up in their personal and social recovery capital. Things get better for them. And this leads to significant increases in well-being. So 3 studies across the space of about 8 years, and we find the same thing. Meaningful activities and social connections are associated with increases in both personal and social recovery capital. Next slide, please. Sorry, I need to take a drink. Now, the next study that I'm going to talk about is a European study, which I was delighted to lead on. And so this was in those glorious days before Brexit. We got some European, what's called Horizon 2020 money to study recovery pathways, comparing men and women in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. 4 countries, and part of the reason we chose those 4 countries was the idea was recovery as a policy principle had been relatively well embedded in Scotland and England since 2007, 2008. But that in Belgium and the Netherlands was an emerging concept when we did this work. And we, as you'll see from the slide, we first disseminated this at a conference in March 2021. So we asked people to complete a survey, which was called the Life and Recovery Survey, which we have adapted at various points from Favor's original Life and Recovery Survey. And then we asked people to participate in an outcome study. And I'll say a bit more about the extra wave of outcome data collection we collected shortly. But if we can go to the next slide, please, Hayley. Yeah. So basically what we found was, and what we were trying to do was retrospectively create pathways to recovery. So in our first wave of data collection from life and recovery data, we basically found that, well, there are national differences, and I'm only going to touch on this briefly, but every study I have done about different kind of contexts and locations has essentially found the same kind of things. One, in all contexts, there are multiple pathways to recovery for most people. So they won't have used a single mechanism or method to try and support the recovery journey. 2, but there are contextual differences. And one of the things I would argue is against any notions of recovery universality. I think recovery has a contextual specificity. And one of the major areas in research, and Emily Hennessy and myself pointed this out in our Recovery Capital paper, is most of our research is on white middle-aged men. White middle-aged men who are either drinkers or opiate addicts. And for me, one of the things we need to do is look much, much more diversely, both in terms of gender and in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of context. Far too much of the recovery research is North American, and we really need to understand much, much more cultural variability. And you'll see a bit of that there. Next slide, because this is much more interesting, I think. One of the things that we are currently writing up from this study is, for the actual outcome study, we had successfully recruited 313 people who were deliberately recruited in quotas from whether they'd been in early recovery, the first year of the recovery journey at the time of recruitment, sustained recovery between 1 and 5 years in recovery at the start of the study, or more than 5 years in recovery. And we found that significantly lower rate of relapse than had been reported previously by the Michael Dennis study. That 10.4% of people relapsed over the course of the year of us following them. More men relapsed compared to women, which is potentially surprising and slightly interesting. But what we noticed was a very, very powerful effect of the longevity of recovery. So if you already had 5 years under your belt at the start of our study, you were extremely unlikely to relapse. 1.5% of people who were in stable recovery at the study start relapsed in the course of the year of the study. People in sustained recovery, so they had between 1 and 4 years at the start of the study, 17.6% of them relapsed. But for people in the first year of their recovery journey, 30% relapsed over the course of our year of study. Now, what this suggests, and what this provides evidence for to me, is this idea that getting people through to that 5-year time point significantly changes their likelihood of lapse and relapse. And you kind of say, well, of course, that's obvious. What we didn't find was a particular ceiling effect. And, one of the things I think that's probably wrong about the Betty Ford model is it kind of implies there's just a flatlining and stability beyond the 5-year points. And that might be true for relapse, but I don't think it's true for some of the other recovery growth indicators and measures. Anyway, that's for another day. What we also found was that there was significantly better functioning for individuals whose recovery journeys included peer-based recovery support services. People whose recovery journeys included at least some form of peer-based support, whether that was RCOs, 12-step groups, or other forms of peer support. They had higher levels of higher baseline levels of quality of life and social functioning, lower levels of justice involvement at baseline and follow-up, and lower baseline levels of unmet need. In other words, people do better when they have peer-based recovery support, but crucially, people who had both peer-based and professional services in their journey did better than people who only had one. Now, this study, as I said, was a European Horizon 2020 study. We finished data collecting about 3 months before the first UK lockdown and the following COVID. And we were very fortunate to get some money from the UK Economic and Social Research Council to look at what happened to these people over the course of the first year of lockdown. And what is perhaps surprising and certainly was interesting for us was, given that people have reported a 10.4% relapse rate prior to COVID, that actually slightly reduced in the year following the onset of lockdown and COVID. In other words, lockdown and COVID did not lead to a significant increase in relapse in this population. In some ways, embedded them more strongly into their recovery communities. And we are in the process of kind of making sense of this and writing this up at the moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've talked a lot about various kinds of research and data, and now I'm going to go on to start talking about how we measure and my own journey in the measurement process. Now, I mentioned that I'd done that work with Alexandra Lodi for the Royal Society for the Arts, where we started creating a taxonomy of recovery. And that led us basically to developing 2 scales. The first was the Recovery Group Participation Scale, which was effectively an amendment of some work from a William White monograph, and the assessment of recovery capital. And the assessment of recovery capital, we worked very closely with a recovery organisation in Scotland called the Lothian and Edinburgh Abstinence Project, and I'd want to thank them for their contribution. And we basically developed this 50-item scale that was a strengths-based scale. So 25 of the items measured personal recovery capital, 25 of the items measured social recovery capital. It led to a total scale of 50 items, which people endorsed or they didn't. And subsequently, Corey Vilsaint and colleagues from the Recovery Research Institute came up with a not very imaginatively named, but highly effective brief assessment of recovery capital scale, which has only 10 items and has 1 item from each of the prior subscales to create a short version. But in my view, it has the same problem as the overall assessment of recovery capital, which was researchers quite liked it. And I think the assessment of recovery capital has now been translated into 8 languages and has been used in quite a lot of research studies. But in practice, it was of no great value to practitioners who would kind of say, well, what's the point of that? I don't see what I'm supposed to do with that. What does a score mean? What am I supposed to do about it? And that led to a significant furthering of the work in this area. Next slide, please. And so we developed something called the RECCAP. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about over the next little while is about the RECCAP. And the RECCAP was essentially the development of an online system that creates the capacity not only to map where people are and get instant feedback on where they are, but also to start to say, well, what do you do with that? So the idea of this is, and this is complicated from a research and science and testing point of view, is that the RECCAP is both a measurement instrument, but it also leads to an intervention. So we have the problem of saying, well, you can't use the RECCAP to assess the effectiveness of the RECCAP because it is both an instrument, but also something that directly feeds into a planning model and an engagement model. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the model is called MPE. So the idea is the RECCAP is a scale, which is a compendium measure of largely validated and tested psychometrically instruments that then provides you with the foundations for recovery care planning, which in turn informs the process of engagement in social networks and in community supports and community capital. And I mentioned earlier, I would see myself as much more a kind of research activist than any kind of pure academic researcher. My job is fundamentally about saying, how do we make this stuff work and make this stuff have value and meaning for people in a range of different applied settings? Next slide, please. So what we have here on the right-hand side is effectively a visualization that we present to people pretty much as soon as they've completed filling in the scale. And people can do this on their laptop or they can do it on their mobile phone. And they will get this score process instantly that will tell people, basically, it will create a single numeric score, which is on the top right-hand corner. You will see there something called the Recovery Capital Index, which is essentially the sum of the strengths and of the positive, negative capital, positive recovery capital and the negative recovery capital. And you will see on the left-hand side, the list of the domains that constitute the REC cap. And they are 5 items measuring quality of life and satisfaction, and so on down. I'm not going to go through these. But in our work, what we have found is that, in essence, the intervention component of the model has to attempt to address barriers and unmet needs before it goes on to talking about building strengths and building resources over time. So this is the model that we utilize, and we present it using a traffic lighted model that strengths are presented in green, areas where the person's doing okay are presented in amber, and areas that are strengths are presented in red. So that's the basic foundation of this approach. So next slide, please. And the idea here is, I think you might need to click again. I think there might be something embedded into this slide. So if we can just pop that forward. Yes, fabulous. So we have the left-hand 2 columns provide you with the scores on negative recovery capital, and the 5 on the right-hand side are the summary scores, the domain scores for positive recovery capital. And in essence, the aim here is very simple. How do we design and develop interventions? So what we have done is, in spite of using standardized scales, we are constantly attempting to use the data that comes in to amend and develop this. And as we stand at the moment, we have just over 19,000 completed RECCAP forms. So we have a huge database that allows us to effectively adapt the weightings based on the predictive power of each of our factors. Next slide, please. Perfect. And the crucial thing, and I think one of the most exciting things for me that has happened in the last period since I presented this kind of work is we now are able to create recovery care plan goals and goal templates based on the score profiles that people provide. What does this mean? Well, the score profiles that people offer aren't just fed back to them, although that is crucially important. They provide suggested areas for how the person should develop. And the original iteration of this for us is it's done on a kind of 90-day cycle so that people will complete the form, they will engage in whatever care planning they need to do and engage in the activities that they agree with their recovery worker. Then they will, at the 90-day review point, they will both evaluate the successes and failures they've had in meeting those goals. They'll re-identify and reassess their needs and their goals. And then they will set a new set of goals based partly on the previous successes and partly on the recompletion of the RECCAP. And that allows us also to start mapping trajectories over time. Next slide, please. And you will see again, this is just another way of iterating that point. The aim here is that the recovery goal planning utilizes both those internal resources identified, but also those external things, those social support networks and community resources. So it broadly follows the model of our pie diagram for the Royal Society for the Arts on the left, those personal recovery capital factors on the right, social and community capital factors. And this is crucial as we attempt to try and identify what the profile of need is likely to be and where that's likely to lead the individual. Next slide, please. So the last section of this work is going to be around some of the development and testing of this. So This delightful establishment is called HMP Home House, which is a prison in the northeast of England, and you'll see from the aerial view, it is a fairly standard UK prison. An adult male, what's called Category C prison, that typically holds around 1,200 prisoners. But it was also named as the first drug recovery prison in the UK. So this prison was identified and created as a specifically recovery-focused prison and a recovery-focused initiative. And we were very privileged that we were allowed to implement and test the REC cap in Home House. So we were able to utilize this partly to test its implementability, but also to start to say, well, does the idea of creating recovery drug-free wings with additional security features outside and intensive therapeutic processes inside, does it make a difference? Next slide, please, Hayley. And we found that it did. We found that it did, that there were, over the course of the first 3-month pilot, there were marked reductions in unmet service needs and barriers to recovery, significant improvements in personal and social recovery capital, recovery group engagement and quality of life. However, one of the things we found that was very interesting for us was that in UK prisons, you typically have 3 populations. You have drug and alcohol workers who are available to do some of this stuff. You have prison officers, and you have peers who are on some kind of privileged status and who've established their credentials within the prison. Well, we had a significant failure with the REC cap because the prison officers, prison warders, were completely uninterested in supporting this process. However, what we found was that peers could readily be trained and supported to deliver the REC cap quickly and effectively without any additional costs and resources. Okay, now I'm going to switch from a prison in the northeast of England to what's been the main bread and butter of our work, which has been our work in recovery residences in the United States. So I'm going to start in Florida. Next slide, please. Where and we have just published this paper. This paper was published, I think, about 3 weeks ago, where we started to look at the growth of recovery capital in various ways. Sorry, rather bizarrely. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. Apologies for that. My son just arrived home, so I'm sorry for the interruptions there. So I'll try and get my flow back. So yes, the idea here was we switched from the UK to the US, and we started to track and map changes in recovery capital in a number of recovery residences in Florida. Next slide, please. Sorry, I've slightly lost my flow now. And it allowed us to do 2 things. One was to track retention, and the second was to track changes in recovery capital over time. And we found that in the recovery residence in Florida, poor retention was associated with being younger, with being female, having lower involvement in recovery groups, and having greater needs around housing. Next slide, please. We also found that for those who were retained, greater recovery capital growth was associated with being employed, having higher levels of social support, having more recovery group involvement, being younger, and having a higher quality of life. So what we found here basically was that we could use the REC cap as a mechanism for starting to say there are certain groups and populations who are not retained so well, but also as a way of starting to say among those who are retained, what predicts change over time. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We are currently working on a larger US state data where we're doing the same kind of testing on a larger population, where we found that the strongest effects predicting retention in recovery residents were for people not using substances and people who were Black or African American. Explaining barriers to recovery and to improving recovery capital, focused on avoiding ongoing substance use, lack of support needs around accommodation, higher psychological well-being, and measures associated with social support and quality of life. Okay, next slide, please. And what we started to show is that recovery capital growth in recovery residence populations can be charted over time. In other words, what we get, and what's particularly important from the recovery residences, is that we start to show that strengths grow over the time people are there and grow very dramatically over the course of the first 3 months, but then that effectively plateaus but does not diminish over the subsequent period. And that this growth is associated with positive strengths and well-being. Next slide, please. And for me, one of the things that's crucially important about our model is not only does it allow us to characterize change over time, it allows us to identify and engage community assets, to create pathways to pro-social groups, to meet individual life needs and aspirations, to build hope and strengths, and to create personalized interests and activity compatible with skills and needs. And in essence, what our model is about is effectively saying, not just how should somebody get better, but how can we identify those resources, both in networks and community assets, that support and enhance that process of change. So for me, one of the big things about interventions about recovery are that they're not so singularly or solely focused on individual change pathways, but they are focused on the context of change. And they're focused on the idea of mobilizing social support systems and recovery pathways that allow those changes to happen. Next slide, please. Within a recovery model, the idea is that there will be different rates of trajectories for different populations, but that we need to attempt to match up at the back end of our MPE model, community engagement through a process of social connection and community engagement, and building assets over time. So what steps are necessary to promote recovery? Asset-based community development, training and developing people who can be those connectors within recovery communities, preparing clients to engage with groups, creating in-reach and outreach models, and developing those models and supporting them over time. And I realize steps 4 and 5 stay the same thing, but they shouldn't. Okay, can I move to the next slide, please? And in our work in attempting to mobilize this process, we've identified that people typically need to engage with 4 different types of community resources that can be counted, mapped, and encouraged. And I think there is an equivalent. When I was in Michigan a couple of weeks ago looking to adapt our RECAP for community recovery organizations, the idea was that we should look at 4 different types of resource: mutual aid groups, recreation and sport, volunteering, education and employment, and peer and recovery community groups. Next slide, please. And when we attempted to do this in the UK, what we did was we trained 21 people in long-term recovery over about 3 months, and we got them to go out and mobilize community assets. Now, this is in a city in England called Sheffield with high levels of deprivation and poverty, and they managed to open around 134 doors to recovery pathways. This was used to help people build, and this is very much the idea of the helper principle. And based on the idea of the intrinsically social model of recovery, and just to recap, the idea here is recovery is based on developing personal strength. But to do that and to develop a recovery science, we need to understand how to create those positive social connections and how to mobilize those social connections to create access to meaningful activity. So the underlying rationale and what we showed was feasible in this study was the capacity to mobilize local resources to allow people access to assets that would support their recovery journeys. Next slide, please. And this is all predicated on the notion that recovery is something that happens in a supported way. So as I mentioned, I used to work at a large teaching hospital in South London, and in a study led by my colleague, Victoria Manning, we were interested in trying to see how we could get acutely unwell people actively involved in 12-step groups, really to test that linkage component. And basically what we had was, in our acute assessment unit, which was an emergency admission 10 days ward for alcohol, heroin and crack, we had very, very low rates of clients who attended any form of 12-step or mutual aid meeting while they were there. So we conducted a trial with 3 conditions. The first condition, and it was 153 people in this trial, Well, the first condition, people only got a leaflet telling them about the meetings. In the second condition, their booking in doctor actively encouraged them to attend. But the third and the assertive peer linkage component was a peer came and talked to them about meetings beforehand, took them to the meetings, took them for a coffee afterwards, and explained what happened after the meeting. Those in the assertive linkage condition had more meeting attendances on the ward, less substance use in the 3 months after the ward, and more ongoing meeting attendance in the 3 months after their time on the ward. What were our key conclusions from this study? Conclusion number 1, giving people a leaflet is the pointless abuse of dead trees. Condition number 2, and apologies to any medics in the audience, but a booking in doctor is only marginally more useful than a dead tree. And that if we want people to effectively engage in recovery process, it's a primarily peer-driven social contagion effect of active engagement. If you go back to the earlier slide, the idea is people who are low in social capital and low in community capital need to be assertively and supportively linked by peers to community resources to help build those capital that will in turn build the internalized personal resources they need. Next slide, please. So just to finish, and in the last 5 minutes or so, I want to say a little bit about where we are, about some innovation and new developments in this area. So if we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to come back to this, the paper that I published, or we published last year. I think one of the challenges for us is to characterize, as I started to show, how recovery capital changes over time and what the conditions are that promote and support those changes in recovery capital, including things like community connections, assertive attempts to change social networks, assertive attempts to overcome social isolation, and to attempt to try and modify and work on the contextual environment as a way of helping to build recovery capital over time. We also need to understand far, far better the context in which recovery should happen. And for me, one of the big challenges, and that effectively renders the recovery versus harm reduction debate meaningless, is I think we need to get much, much earlier into the process of saying, how do we map this process of change and support this process of change over time? So this is a crucially important issue around developing these models. Next slide, please. So what are the core aims? The core aims are to look at new populations and new theories, but also to try and extend that up, because a logical consequence of a capital model is if we think recovery is not something that happens only at the individual level, but happens in social groups and social networks, then we need to look at collective processes of change. And collective processes of change are crucially important as a way of understanding and predicting change over time. So the idea of systems thinking, I think, is very consistent. And it looks to me like the work on recovery-oriented systems of care, which started very strongly, grew significantly in 2009, 2010, with 2009, 2011, with the SAMHSA publication, followed by a book by William White and John Kelly, an edited book where they reviewed systems, but it's kind of faded. And I think this is an area where I think there's huge need for research. And the idea here would be, we look at recovery capital as an individual measurable component, but also at a collective level, where we look at how you would measure recovery capital at the group and the location level, as well as at the individual level. Next slide, please. For me, part of this work and part of the work I'm now starting to do with the Institute of Behavioral Research at Texas Christian University is to think about how to measure recovery capital as both a personal construct, not both, as all of a personal construct, something that can be measured at the level of the individual recovery coach, navigator, or worker, something that can be measured at the level of service, but also something that can be measured at an institutional level. And this very much duplicates or replicates the work that the Institute of Behavioural Research did with treatment services and their treatment process model. That if you want to understand who does well, you need to understand some of those personal characteristics, but you need to layer it within different types of support organizations. So for me, this is crucial to developing an effective recovery model. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we have also started to try and do, and we've developed and we're about to start testing, is the notion of a human capital measurement tool, where we measure human capital from family members. And the idea here is to create an equivalent of a recovery capital tool, but that would be used with family members, so that when family members start that recovery journey, we can map their own growth and well-being in a strengths-based model that looks at many of the same domains, but not exactly the same domains as recovery capital, but that can be used as a much more generic general population as assessment. And the final area of development for me is around saying, how do we hone and develop specific recovery-focused interventions that we can then test and assess as part of this process for change? Next slide, please. So finally to the conclusion, and I'm sorry for speaking for so long. There are two fundamental component parts for me to an effective model of recovery and recovery process. One is the underlying principle of progress and process through CHIME. The idea of how do we unpack that and how do we start to conceptualize and measure various ideas of how CHIME is implemented in practice. And that links to our model and metric of recovery capital, which gives us that framework for saying, what should we count and how should we count it? But this also relies on the idea that there is a split and a dichotomy between what happens as a kind of peer-to-peer transmission or the contagion of recovery, and what might happen in professional groups and communities, the cascade of the principles of recovery that allows the conditions to be created for individuals to change and recover. And an idea that I have borrowed from criminology is the idea of collective and personal efficacy. That in essence, one of the core predictors of effective crime intervention at a community level is the idea of a radius of trust, or a growth of trust and collective efficacy, where people will intervene and support neighbours and know about their communities as part of that process. And that links to the idea that there is a fundamental notion for people in recovery, as in desistance from crime, to be active participants in transmitting not only that message, but also the contagion of hope. And we need to expand that model. And in recovery, I think it's intrinsic that we expand that model beyond the individual to the group and the community. So I apologize for the interruption. I managed to get my day wrong of what day I was expecting my son to arrive, so I apologize for that, and the general level of amateurishness that goes with that. And thank you very much. So one final thing, I have just started my own website about recovery capital called cultivatingrecoverycapital.com, and I'd be delighted for any of you to go and have a look and offer me any thoughts and feedback on the work that I do. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Best. Really appreciate your presentation and taking the time to share with us at Addiction Policy Forum and JCOIN all the amazing work that you're doing. We have some time left for questions. So if you have a question for Dr. Best, please put it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to dig into a few questions and then hand it over to Julia too to see if she has any questions as well. But we had one that came in early on that asked about the definition of recovery. So how are we identifying recovery?
Yeah, and look, I mean, for me, I have tried to go with the two consensus models. So the two consensus models have basically argued there are three component parts to recovery, either abstinence or control over substance use. And in the UK, we've tended to prefer control rather than complete abstinence. Secondly, something about global health and well-being, so markers of quality of life, physical health and psychological health. And the third domain's around citizenship. So it's active participation in your neighbourhood or active participation in your family, plus for for me, there's the component of the Goya part about volunteering, education, training, and employment. So for me, there's two parts to citizenship, and they contribute to giving people a sense of meaning and purpose.
That's very helpful. I love how you broke it out and also kind of gave more clarity that in the UK there might be more preference for control of use, where we will find a lot of preference for abstinence in the US. But having a definition that includes both, I think, provides more clarity.
Yeah, and look, you know, for me, it seems to me likely that in a long-term recovery journey, the vast majority of people will at least need some period of complete abstinence. However, whether that's complete abstinence includes prescribed medication is not really for me to comment on or say, and I think that's very much a personal decision. But I think it will certainly involve abstinence from alcohol, illicit drugs, and non-prescribed diverted drugs.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question also from Lori. What is the impact on the ice cream cone with negative social identity?
Negative social identity. Yeah, I mean, what I think happens with positive and negative aspects of recovery capital is there is a constant tension. So there are things that will happen, and self-stigma is a perfect example of negative social capital, when people won't undertake tasks and activities. So negative social identities will happen, negative recovery capital identities will frequently happen when people belong to stigmatized groups. And the solution to that happens at the same three levels. There's that personal journey of transformation towards empowerment and positive identities. There's the changes in social networks and social belonging, which is very much about moving from excluded, marginalized, and stigmatized groups to pro-social and inclusive groups. And then there's the broader community component, which is really about that sense, which I guess some people find quite hard to accept, that recovery capital relies on the conditions for capital being created by services, systems, and governments that allow people to recover. And we talk about disintegrative shaming as a mechanism by which people are blocked from that pathway. In other words, once they have been labeled as an addict, or once they have been identified in that way, so employers won't take them on, colleges won't give them a start, they won't get housing in certain areas. And effectively what that does is it creates glass ceilings, and it creates negative systems and identities around people. So the notion of both identity and broader recovery capital change relies on all three levels engaging of personal change, social network change, and community access to community resource.
No, that's so important to spell out, because even if you have great individual or sort of social capital, if we don't do the work on the community side, creating that glass ceiling or having an inhospitable community for those in recovery is going to limit how effective we are. So that's why we love your recovery capital. It's required reading to work at Addiction Policy Forum.
Oh, fabulous. I'm delighted to hear it.
We have quite a few questions that have come in about RECCAP. So I'm going to bundle some of them together, but is RECCAP in the public domain?
The instrument is, the system isn't. So the instrument is absolutely available to people who want to use it. The system is been developed through an organization called Get Help, and is Recovery Outcomes Institute is a not-for-profit that's currently testing and developing it. So as a process, as a way of developing all those parts of measure, plan, engage. No, it's not publicly available. If people want to have a look at the instrument, by all means, send me an email and I'd be delighted, or drop me a message at cultivatedrecoverycapital.com, and I'll send them a copy of the basic measure.
Another question related to RECCAP, is it appropriate to be administered by a peer professional?
Absolutely. And in some ways it's designed to be administered by peer professionals. I mean, I have deliberately tried to avoid anything that requires more than a couple of days training. So basically, as I mentioned in the context of HMP Home House, we were able to train prisoners to use the RECCAP, and we were able to train peer prisoners to support not only the delivery of the RECCAP, but the interpretation of the results and the resulting care planning work. So yeah, absolutely. And we've got good, consistent evidence of that.
That's great. And we'll make sure that, just as a reminder, we're going to post to our JCOIN network, to our APF network, the video from today's webinar. So if you want to take notes or have be able to watch Dr. Best's lecture again, you'll be able to do so very soon. We'll also include his slide deck and contact information. So if you want more info about RECCAP in particular, we'll make sure that we get you connected. We have another question that came in from Charles. It said, in your research with justice and addiction populations, what rate of participant retention did you achieve, and what strategies were effective in keeping participants engaged longitudinally?
Now, if they are, so the work I talked about at Home House, it was prisoners while they were in prison. So it's much less of a challenge engaging people longitudinally there and then. And really for me, if we're looking at through the gate studies, which would be the UK term for how do you follow people up from in prison to out of prison, then the primary mechanism really is around using peer researchers. So I'm absolutely fundamentally committed to that idea that we use peer researchers. Now, one of the things that we have some data on, which I'm really excited about analysing, is for the RECCAP, we have a prison in Virginia called the Chesterfield Heart Programme, where we've got data about change in prisoners in the recovery capital in prison. But we also have a group of around 300 prisoners where we have data when they're in prison and then follow-up data when they're in recovery residences back in the community. And we are just about to start looking at what some of those predictors of change are. Because they were moving to recovery residences, the retention there was pretty good. I need to look up and see what the attrition rate was among people who didn't move to recovery residences. But I imagine, sadly, that was probably quite significant, but that wasn't really the aim of the study, this study.
Thank you. We have a few minutes, so I'm going to try to get through a few more. More RECCAP questions coming in, so we may put you in touch and send Dr. Best's website to you all after the presentation. So we had another question that came in about using the tool in treatment settings. We have a couple questions that are kind of there. So is this appropriate for SUD treatment?
Yeah, so the answer there is yes, it is, although it's much less well tested there. And I would say it's suitable for, and I think it's absolutely needed in MAT type settings. It seems to me one of the things that I think is a policy or a philosophical failure in the UK, at least, is the notion that recovery capital should be built after people complete treatment and that we should start the recovery journey as a kind of aftercare. Well, sadly, what that means is an awful lot of people never get there. And I hope people picked up the kind of philosophical neutrality from my point of view. This is about how you get people into pro-social networks, how you get people to actively engage in communities, to engage in meaningful activities. It seems to me that applies no less in structured treatment settings. In terms of the types of treatment, at the moment, one of our core partners is Odyssey in New Zealand, and they have residential treatment services as well as prison treatments where the RECCAP has been rolled out. A couple of weeks ago, along with my partner Jessica, we were in Michigan, where we were testing the RECCAP for suitability for recovery community organizations. So that's also a setting we're starting to look at as a potential setting for rolling out the RECCAP. So yes, if you're going to say to me, is there really good data available on how well it works there? No, there's not. But that work is underway. And in principle and philosophically, it seems to me to make huge sense to roll it out in those settings.
So why wait, right? So getting started on being aware of what recovery capital exists and also where you need to shore up more capital, whether that's in treatment settings, recovery housing, or in criminal justice settings, prison or jail. So we'd be very interested in learning more about any data you have at JCOIN for those that are justice involved, measuring recovery capital to improve long-term outcomes.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'd be more than happy to continue that dialogue with you, Jess, and with anyone else on the call.
Oh, that'd be great. I had another question from Michelle. Knowing the changes in the brain and lack of control over their environment, how does this research apply to adolescents?
One of my, Emily Hennessy, one of my colleagues, is doing some of this work and testing this out with adolescents. Absolutely no idea how that will work or how effective that will be. Again, in principle, this is about building personal and social capital, it shouldn't be restricted by those kind of questions of age or demographic status. I mean, we'll find different profiles of change. We're in early stages of doing that. So the model of trying to build those internal skills and resources seems to me incredibly powerful for adolescents. Doing it via engaging with community resources seems to me very important. And I think that was your dog saying hello, Jess.
Yeah, they wanted to weigh in on that topic a little bit.
Excellent.
Yeah, I do think that in sort of the prevention world for adolescents, recovery capital and looking at risk and protective factors, there is a lot of overlay and synergy between those. So I think there's a lot of promise in applying this to adolescents who are struggling with SUD.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely.
So does Luna. She agrees completely. So how many recovery capital qualitative care metrics through the personal, social, and community care markers?
Oh, I have no idea. That sounds, is this an American policy question? If so, I'm not sure what that relates to. So sorry, I'm not able. If the person wants to follow up with me, I'll attempt to try and answer it, but I don't know.
All right, we'll move on to another question then. I appreciate that. Should measuring recovery capital become standard in measuring the effectiveness and success of modalities in SUD treatment?
Totally. I mean, it seems to me that long-term, we are helping people to try and rebuild their lives, whatever definition of recovery capital you have. And so, it seems to me that there needs to be a transition in any form of intervention away from simply measuring how many symptoms you've got to how much resource you have for rebuilding and sustaining positive change.
Very helpful. Any other questions that come in? So we do have someone who's interested in recovery capital in a court setting. Would recovery capital work for either a problem-solving court or a treatment court?
I'm delighted to say we are currently engaged in a pilot with 2 courts. One, the Hope Court in Boston, and the second, the Rise Court in Rhode Island. And we have submitted our first journal paper based on the preliminary findings there. We've got some nicely positive early findings, but the thing that I think is most encouraging was that working with the probation officers in both of those settings, they really see the value of this and they really think it's improved their practice in working with substance using offenders in therapeutic courts.
Well, that's excellent. We have a question that came in from, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce your name correctly, but Monsees. Any input or advice for hiring lived experience in doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to, like, the first thing I would say is, if you're going for a recovery model that's predicated on this social model of recovery, you would be using the recovery capital measurement methods with the workers, the peer navigators, as well as the people they're working with. So the idea of any recovery intervention is there should be a contagion of hope and a contagion of strength building. So, that very much it's designed to be a peer-based, peer-delivered system that should be about mutual growth and mutual benefit. And the underlying ideas of the helper principle that doing this should lead to well-being growth in both populations.
I think one of our last questions maybe for today, a whole bunch more have come in. We might share these with you in case you can point us in the direction of some of your articles or other pieces on recovery capital, and we can include that on our website for follow-up resources and materials. But one question that came in is to speak a little bit more about why social connection is so highly important in facilitating and the attainment of recovery. I know you've spoken a lot about this, both the meaningful activities and social connection being so critical, but that social piece, I feel like this is an important concept to really impart upon folks that are working in the field, because when you're maintaining relationships with a using network, when you're not rebuilding those social connections, that's such a sort of a takeaway from your ability to be healthy and and your well-being. So if you could just speak a little bit about that. That's a question from Richard.
The 2 fundamental barriers to recovery would appear to be both social isolation and maintaining networks that are involved in the norms and values and belief systems around substance use. And I think social identity models would clearly suggest that you can recover well. And we did some work with youth in Australia a number of years ago where we showed clearly that people who go back to their old social networks after treatment virtually universally relapsed. Why is it important to be around other people that are in recovery? Well, if you look at the three most evidence, so when Keith Humphreys and Anna Lemke did their review of what works in recovery, the three things they identified were recovery housing, particularly Oxford housing, peer-based delivered interventions, and 12-step mutual aid groups. What do they all have in common? They all have in common the fundamental underlying principles identified by Rudolf Moose, which is social learning and social control, the power of role modeling of recovery. And that I want what you have, that notion that if you observe and learn how to recover, it's a process over time, and that you become embedded in networks that tighten around you and create the conditions that allow recovery to change. I think every recovery model starts with that assumption that the effectiveness of 12-step is a perfect example where so much of this is about social process of shaping and learning.
I love that, the mentorship and the learning from your peers, because we should not discount the work that it takes to learn how to live your life and cope with life in different ways. And so much of that comes from the peer structure. Well, we are at time. I did have one question that came in that I think I missed at the beginning about, are there specific states that you're doing work in right now in the US?
Yeah, at the moment, the three main states are Virginia, Michigan, and Maryland.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure you'll have other folks reaching out to you for potential sites for more recovery capital work and studies. We're so grateful to you for taking time. I don't know if Julia had any questions or any words to wrap us up, but this was such an amazing lecture and so much rich questions and interest from our participants today. So I'm just really grateful for everyone for taking the time, and I'll let Julia have the mic.
So I know we're at time, so I don't want to speak for too long, but just wanted to thank you all for coming. And of course, thank you to Dr. Best for this great presentation. I know we had a great discussion, lots of great questions. And again, I just encourage everyone to check out all of the great resources on the website. We have lots of other great webinars and other tools. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you again all for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.